Welcome back to NetFoundry TV. I am going to give you a walkthrough of the use case for bringing your own certificate authority. And this is useful for bulk creating endpoints from an existing identity provider that you may have. Any certificate authority that you operate that can issue certificates, those certificates can be combined with a configuration value from the management API or the web console to create an endpoint. And of course, an endpoint is uh, a node or entity that uses the Ziti Edge software, either a tunneler that is provided by NetFoundry or your own custom app using a Ziti Edge SDK imported. So that's the software that runs on the edge of your network, and that software needs an identity. Those identities can either come from the built-in CA that comes with Ziti, or you can bring your own by creating a trust relationship between your existing CA and your Ziti network. So let's take a look at our checklist to see what we're going to have to do to accomplish that. Now, in advance, I have gone ahead and created my own CA. That is a prerequisite for you as well. And it's also outside of the scope of this video, how to create a CA or how to operate one. Of course, there are many ways, but the result is always that there is some issuer, which may be your intermediate CA or your root CA if you don't have an intermediate. And from that issuer, you get user certificates. They're also called client certificates. And those are the identities. Those are the public part of the identity that's going to be used by the endpoint software to authenticate. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So the other prerequisite is to have a Ziti network, and we're going to be using the NetFoundry web console to manage a Ziti network because it provides like a graphical workflow for creating that trust relationship with an external CA. So the first step that I'll show you is the import step here, which begins the process of creating the trust relationship between your Ziti network and your external CA. So I'm logged in here to the NetFoundry web console, and our sidebar items, certificates for a selected network that has this ability, will show you a list of your existing CAs. So I'll explain every element in this form, but let's start out describing the external CA that I would like to bring. In my case, it's going to be a root CA, and so the root CA itself issues the certificates. If I had an intermediate CA, then I would want to import that certificate because that's the one that needs to be recognized in the trust relationship if it's going to be providing the user certificates that endpoints will present to the control plane. So it's just the issuer, whether or not you have an intermediate determines whether that's the root or not. So the certificate details will need to come from my terminal, the certificate here, and paste that in to begin the verification workflow, creating that trust relationship. So we don't need to click any more buttons in order to get this whole process started. Just create. And so now in our list here, looks like that has a minimum width. So I'll need to zoom out a little bit to get to it. But there is a download JWT and a verify option for the menu associated with this brand new CA that I've just imported. So let's do both of those things. First, I'll download this file, which will be just a temporary file on my computer. We'll start the verify process here. Okay, so verification is the final step in the procedure to create the trust relationship between my Ziti network and my CA. They both already exist. We just have to get them trusting each other. Well, we have to get the Ziti network trusting the CA because we want our Ziti network to recognize the identities that we create from the external CA. So the way we're going to do that is by proving to the Ziti network that I own this CA, that I have the ability to issue a certificate from this CA. So I'm going to need this verification token, and I'm going to use that as the common name property for a new user certificate. Now, the precise steps that you'll take to issue the certificate are outside the scope of this video, but I'm going to go do that off camera and then rejoin you when I have the issued certificate ready to copy. Great, so just like I printed the CA certificate, here is that user certificate that I've just issued from the same CA. So I'll put that on my clipboard and paste it directly into this form. So that will provide the control plane for my Ziti network with everything it needs to complete the verification of that CA, and it should henceforth trust that CA to issue certificates. Now there's a little bit more configuration. Let's work from right to left here. So enable connections is turned on by default. And this is like a soft kill switch for any endpoints that are created from this CA that we're looking at right now. If this were turned off and I were to attempt to create a new session with one of those identities from the external CA, it wouldn't be authenticated. Authentication would simply fail. So that's turned on, and it can always be turned off, and it affects all of the identities equally. Let's start with pre-create. I'll enable that and show you how it works. So if I want to create an endpoint from or for this external CA, then I'll go into my list of endpoints here and click the plus sign to begin creating one. And I'll change my enrollment method to the CA that I have just imported. And this will be pre-created endpoint 1. So pre-created endpoints are created in the same way that a normal endpoint is created for the built-in CA, only the enrollment method is changed to draw its identity from the external CA. So this particular endpoint that I'm creating will have whatever name and whatever attributes I assign when I create it, just like a normal endpoint. The only difference is that its issuer, its certificate issuer, is my external CA. So in order to use this identity, I will need to download its key. That is the one-time enrollment token. And the contents of that are very similar to the contents of a normal one-time enrollment token for any other endpoint. So let's go ahead and go through the steps to perform the enrollment as it pertains to this kind of endpoint, a pre-created or normal endpoint. So for that, I'm going to pull up a document as a reference. This is our Support Hub article about bringing your own certificate authority. And so I've already done the verification steps, but I'll go ahead and reference this. So the heading for the section where I'm reading right now was the pre-create enroll method. There is a slight difference between that and the one below it, which is auto create and I'll point that out when I get to auto create. But for now, the thing that is uniform or universal for enrolling an endpoint from an external CA is that you need the same four things. Well, you need four things, and those are the certificate and key. A certificate is a signed public key along with metadata, and the private key is the secret that backs that up. So the certificate itself is not a secret, but the key is, and you need both in order to actually use the certificate. And it does get used during enrollment. It's like a cryptographic handshake that needs to occur. So the private key is used at the time of enrollment to prove that the that the enroller is the owner of the certificate. The JWT is the third thing that's always needed for enrollment with an external CA. And just like an enrollment command for the built-in CA, this is the one-time token that I've downloaded, and you can see it right here in my downloads. So the enroll command for the built-in CA would be just like this, except it wouldn't have a certificate and key, because those are, in the case of an endpoint for the built-in CA, those values would be provided during the enrollment process from the built-in CA to the endpoint. And those values would then be stored inside this identity configuration file that is output from the enroll command. But in this case, these file paths will become file paths. Those same file paths will be embedded in the identity config file, this permanent identity config JSON file. All right, so let's run this command. All right, here is our completed enrollment command. This certificate is the one that was issued by my external CA. It's not the CA's own certificate. That's already been imported into the Ziti network. So the Ziti network already trusts that issuer to issue certificates like this one. And here's the key that backs that certificate. That is, it's the same key that was used. It's the same key that was used to compose the certificate signing request that resulted in this certificate. And here is the downloaded one-time enrollment token that I showed you from my browser right down here. And then our output file is the permanent identity configuration. Great. So let's take a look at what is in the resulting identity file. What we can see here is that we have a URL to the controller, and then we have some file paths in here. Make this a little easier to see. So three things I wanted to point out. There's the key, certificate, and the CA. The key is a file path to the key that I just provided to the enroll command. The certificate is similarly a file path to the certificate file that I provided the enroll command. And then we have a certificate authority certificate. So that's the identity of the CA that is expected for further interactions using the certificate. All right. So now that we've done that, what we'll notice about our endpoint in this view is that it'll show up as registered right here. Now it already existed, but it was in an unregistered state until we performed the enroll command. All right, so let's move on to the next step, which is to enroll a pre-created Oh, I got those backwards. Anyway, just invert these two. So we'll move on now to auto created. We just did pre-created. Now let's go back in our console to certificates and enable that additional enrollment method. So what is the purpose of auto create? As you can see, some additional fields become visible when we enable this enrollment method. Unlike the normal enrollment method, auto create has some special powers. All of the endpoints created with this method will have the same naming convention and attributes. So this allows you to generate or automate bulk creating endpoints, which are enrolled on the fly, or created and enrolled at the same time. So the normal method, you create the endpoint and then you enroll it using the certificate from the external CA. With this method, the endpoint doesn't exist until you perform the enrollment. And it's at that time that it is created, and it's created immediately with an enrolled or registered state or status. So if you wanted to create endpoints with unique names and attributes, you would do it in the normal way. You would just go to endpoints shown here, create them with the desired name and attributes and CA. And if you want them to be created automatically when they're enrolled, then you would turn this option on, and these would be auto created. All of the endpoints created in this way will have auto created attributes or whatever is specified in this field. And then they'll all have a conventional name. So if I were to have an endpoint named yellow 1, then the name of my endpoint would be what is shown, what I'll type here in quotes, magenta root CA dash yellow 1. So that would be the name according to this convention. This formatting template is already set to the default value. And you can see there's some additional formatting help available here. If you do wish to use a different naming convention, there are some more tokens that you can add to your template right there. So I'll update my CA to allow the auto-created enrollment method, and we'll demonstrate that. So going back to my reference here, you'll see that our enroll command is very similar. The only difference, in fact, is the source of this file. So when you create an endpoint in the normal way, it has its own one-time enrollment token, which you download and use to enroll it. That's not the case with auto-enrolled. Rather than claiming a unique configuration, all that's necessary is to have a certificate from the trusted CA. And the endpoint's metadata or attributes and name are going to be derived from that CA configuration. So just to give you an example here, we've downloaded this JWT here. I did that as soon as I created the CA, and this JWT is a token, but it is not a secret and it is reusable. Unlike one-time tokens, this one is reusable. So we can use that same token for further enroll command. Okay, so the life cycle for an auto-created endpoint is slightly different. For direct comparison, the normal way was to go into the console, create the endpoint, download the token, and perform enrollment. For an auto-created endpoint, there are fewer steps. And the first step outside the scope of this video is to issue the certificate from my external CA. But once I have that certificate in hand, then we can see from a command like this that it is verifiable. So the verify command just checks to see that a particular certificate, in this case, one named auto-created1, is from a particular CA, issued by a particular CA certificate, or a CA for which represented by this CA certificate. All right, so now that we've verified that, let's perform the enrollment as it is necessary for auto-creating endpoints. So I'll just recall the same enroll command that I used for the pre-created endpoint and Okay, so you saw me make 4 changes. Number 1, we're going to perform the enrollment for a different certificate and key. This one was created for a different endpoint. It's a different identity from the same CA. I also changed the file path for the JWT. For the pre-created endpoint, it was a one-time token, but for this one, it's a reusable CA token. So this is the Magenta Root CA JWT that I downloaded when I first created it. And then their output file just needs to be unique so it doesn't overwrite anything that we already have. All right, so with that done, we should see a new endpoint appear very quickly in our list here. And when it does so, it will already be enrolled. There we go. So we have a new endpoint that just appeared with the expected naming convention, and we can see that its attributes are determined by the CA configuration because it wasn't created in advance, so it has to have standard attributes and a standard or conventional name. And as soon as it appears, it's already registered. Alrighty, that's all that I have for you right now. I will leave a link to the document that I was referencing in the description of this video. And please let me know if this raises any unanswered